Hello friends, I'm here to talk to you guys about Masteron, which is also called drostanolone, which is the chemical name of it. I'm going to call it Masteron because drostanolone is quite a mouthful. First of all, I'd like to say that I believe that Masteron has been assayed. Okay, a little bit of background, right? These anabolic steroids, they agonize, which means they bind to certain steroid receptors in the body. So they may bind to androgen receptors, they may bind to estrogen receptors, they may bind to progesterone receptors, they may bind to mineralocorticoid receptors, they may bind to glucocorticoid receptors. And at each receptor, you have an assay where you can test this molecule with a recombinant receptor. Like you can take a human androgen receptor, recombinant one in a lab, and using an assay, see with what affinity does this steroid bind to it, right? That's one thing. And the second thing is, given the fact that it's bound to it, well, what does affinity mean? It means how tightly does it bind to it. It means can something get that agonist off or antagonist off the receptor? Then the second thing you want to find out is, if it does agonize the receptor or bind to the receptor, does it cause the receptor to turn on? Does it cause a response element, which is what you need to study? So you see, something may bind to the androgen receptor weakly, but it may cause it to respond very quickly. Whereas something else may bind very strongly to the androgen receptor, but not cause much of a response element. You see what I mean? And there's also, you also may bind to the receptor, cause no response element, in which case you're an antagonist of that receptor, or you may be even an inverse agonist, which means you bind to the receptor, but you cause the receptor to do the opposite of what it normally does. So it's all really a little bit complicated. I believe that Masteron was studied for this purpose in the 60s or 50s, but the papers are no longer available to be read online from everything I can research. So I was unable to find studies comparing Masteron's affinity and efficacy at the androgen receptor, and especially at almost any other receptor except the estrogen receptor. So we're not completely able to know exactly what's going on, is what I'm trying to say. The other thing I wanted to say is this. Keep in mind, guys, when you take a steroid, you're not just dealing with that steroid. That steroid is being metabolized in your body. So you're taking Masteron, but Masteron turns into other metabolites in the body. And each of those metabolites has also to be tested at those receptors to understand exactly what's happening when you actually take Masteron. Because you get all these metabolites, and we don't even know what Masteron is doing at the various receptors. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind. And this is quite important because, you know, each of those metabolites, for example, one of those, see, Masteron, for example, may not be a substrate for the aromatase enzyme. Aromatase enzyme converts testosterone into estrogen. If the aromatase enzyme, if Masteron is a substrate for it, it'll try to convert Masteron, not be able to, and that aromatase enzyme will not be useful. So it will not be able to convert, for example, testosterone to estrogen, right? This is sort of how aromasin works. So, for example, it would be nice to know if Masteron was a substrate for aromatase. But that is only one thing. We may find out it's not a substrate for it, but one of its many metabolites in the human body may be a substrate for it. So as you guys can see, looking at this compound from the academic side, it's not so easy to learn much about it. But still, I'm going to give you guys a summary. I did extensive research from the academic papers. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a summary of what I learned from that. And then I'm going to tell you guys about my personal experience and my opinion of Masteron, which I have a strong opinion about. So, first of all, I want you guys to know, if you go to my blog, you'll find my notes there. They're only a couple of pages. They're bullet points divided into sections, very easy to read, all have citations. You can scroll down, open the citation, put that in Google Scholar or anywhere else and read the paper yourself. So I have a large section on the pharmacokinetics, which means what happens when you take the molecule, what does it get metabolized into, how long does it take to get out of the body, how is it excreted, and so on. But I'm not going to go into that too much here. I also have a section on the pharmacodynamics. So basically, this hormone was created, Masteron was created in the 1950s for the treatment of women, mainly with breast cancer. So what was happening was that women were being treated with other steroids like nandrolone, and what was happening was that they were being virilized, which means the women were developing masculine features. Maybe their voices were changing, they were getting hairier, they were losing hair, something like that. So they developed Masteron in the 1950s with the intention of creating a molecule that would affect their estrogen receptors and affect their androgen receptors without making them virilized. Really, it seems almost like this was created to be a SARM, okay? So, now, the thing is, it appears that Masteron does not bind to the estrogen receptors, according to an old paper. However, I made a note in my notes, which you'll see, saying that this doesn't tell us that much because that paper was quite old. And for example, the estrogen beta receptor was only even discovered in 1996. So I'm not sure it's been studied, for example, with the estrogen beta receptor. It does bind, of course, to the androgen receptor though. Also, generally speaking, androgens can reduce estradiol's activity with the nuclear estrogen alpha receptor, for example. While high doses of androgens can sometimes even activate that receptor. We'll get a little bit more into the mixture of the androgens with the estrogen receptor in a second when we talk about cancers. I found one paper showing that Masteron was anabolic in cancerous rats. So that's the only scenario I ever found that it was anabolic. Of course, I'll talk about my personal experience afterwards. Now, in terms of cancers, so basically, it's mostly been tested with breast cancers. So first of all, it reduces the uptake of 17-beta estradiol to breast cancer cells. It also there's one study that shows a lady who took Masteron for 17 months straight developed no virilization. She was 55 years old, but they didn't say how much she took. But I found that to be pretty surprising. I didn't know women take Masteron. I'm not very aware of what women take in terms of steroids, by the way. So also it's been shown to be not superior to nandrolone in terms of causing remission of breast cancer cells in a later study. It's also been shown to be more effective. A SERM like Nolvadex with Masteron has been shown to be more effective than, for example, a SERM with chemotherapy, or chemotherapy with a SERM with Masteron, which is pretty interesting. And so there's a study, a microbial study. So often in these steroid studies, they'll use fungi or microbial organisms to metabolize the molecule into different metabolites, and then they'll test those metabolites out. So there's an interesting study I found in which they tested the metabolites of Masteron from a microbial study on cancer cell lines of various kinds. I mean, what were they specifically? Human cervix, prostate, lung, and colon. In all of these cases, drostanolone or Masteron or one of its metabolites was more effective than the chemotherapeutic medication cisplatin at killing the cancer cells, which I found really, really interesting. I don't know why it's so cytotoxic at cancer cells. I mean, of course, the paper doesn't elucidate the mechanisms, and it's a very curious thing to me as well. So it may be an anti-cancer drug, who knows? But keep in mind, these human cancer cell lines are very odd things. They're like immortal cells that are, I don't really understand the biology, or maybe I did understand, I forgot, but there's some biology behind it. But basically, these human cancer cells are taken from a kind of cell in the body that can live on its own. So these cells are not really normal. They're like immortal cells. And there's certain lines of them, they're very well known. When something is cytotoxic to these cells, it doesn't necessarily mean that if a person who has that cancer takes that thing, the thing will also kill those cancer cells in his body, because it's, you know, quite a bit removed, meaning it has less validity to the real life, because it's a little bit removed from it. Also, so that's the cancer part. And then I want to tell you guys a little bit about the breast cancer treatments in the 70s and 80s. So in the early 2000s, it was shown that androgens could inhibit some of the response elements, as I described before, of the estrogen alpha receptor. But more recent research indicates that, so there are certain kinds of breast cancer lines. The estrogen receptor negative lines that are HER positive, which is a kind of breast cancer, genetic predisposition to breast cancer. The androgen signaling in those contexts may actually be oncogenic and promote the cancer growth. So it really depends on what kind of breast cancer it is, whether this androgen receptor signaling can reduce estradiol's oncogenic means growing a cancer, oncogenic effect on the breast cancer. So basically Masteron is there to limit estradiol's effect on the estrogen receptor, on the alpha estrogen receptor, which grows the breast cancer. You see what I mean? Which is also why they use SERMs, right? To limit estrogen's ability to affect that. So yeah, and I made a final note on my notes. It's not to do with Masteron. I just want to mention other androgens also affect estrogen receptors. For example, DHEA does. 3-beta-androstenediol, which is a metabolite of DHT, regulates brain function by modulating the beta estrogenic receptors. So there are androgens that do that. So that's the review of the academic evidence. Now, in terms of my own experience, I've actually used Masteron quite a bit in my life, and I believe I was mistaken in doing so. If I could go back, I would never have used Masteron. It's not because Masteron caused me particular harm. It seems to be quite innocuous. It doesn't seem to be very dangerous compared to other steroids, but basically, let me explain why. So the reason why people like myself used to use Masteron is because we wanted to inhibit aromatization to some degree from aromatizable compounds like testosterone, or a compound, for example, that upregulates estrogen receptors via agonizing the progesterone receptors, like, for example, nandrolone. Nandrolone makes you bloated and watery, but that's not because of progesterone. It agonizes progesterone receptors, upregulating estrogen receptors, and so on. So our goal was to reduce aromatization. But why didn't we just use an aromatase inhibitor? The reason was because for a very long time, aromatase inhibitors were thought to cause cardiovascular disease. Because for a long time, it was not clear whether, so what was observed in breast cancer patients, female breast cancer patients, is that those who were given, and I've covered this by the way in former videos, you can look on my channel, search estrogen or aromatase inhibitor, but basically this is what happened. There were observations that female breast cancer patients that took an aromatase inhibitor had worse cardiovascular results, like their lipids were worse, or potentially they had more atherogenic effects, than those women that took SERMs like Nolvadex. So it was thought that the aromatase inhibitors could be worsening cardiovascular health. Later, it was realized that it was actually the SERMs that were improving lipid parameters, like SERMs like Nolvadex dramatically lower LDL cholesterol and stuff like that. So it was actually the SERMs that were protective. Now, estrogen is protective, but aromatase inhibitors are not harmful by themselves. They're only harmful because of reducing estrogen availability, which is also debatable whether that's harmful or not, but I think it is. But that's the issue there. So it's not that anti-estrogens or aromatase inhibitors particularly are harmful, it's that having less estrogen is harmful, or using a SERM is helpful for your cardiovascular results. Now, I should mention to you guys that are thinking about this right now and say, oh, I should use a SERM because I want my LDL cholesterol to be good, which is true. It works. It does lower it will lower your LDL cholesterol. And relaxofene, by the way, will have less side effects than Nolvadex will. But all of them, relaxofene, Nolvadex, Clomid, all of them have been associated with worsening eye conditions in people who take them in the long term. So that's not really a good option in the long term. So, unfortunately, because basically you need estrogen to be there, but some people are going to go glands, so they need the Nolvadex. The only way they can have estrogen high is if they use Nolvadex or relaxofene, but if they do that, they put their eyes at risk. So anyway, the point is, I've been a little bit long-winded, but what I'm trying to get at is that we were mistaken in using Masteron. We used it because we thought, okay, this will give us some added benefit, and it's not going to harm us like the aromatase inhibitor. So it's not going to harm us, and it may give us some other benefit. We thought it may magnify the effects of some other steroids and stuff like that. I'm not sure if it may magnify the effects of other steroids or not. I'm not completely certain. I think it does so more on a visual effect. It's just a visual thing. I think it's because of the change it has on water retention. Of course, Masteron, by the way, will reduce your water retention a little bit. I mean, not hugely. But that effect may be something like that. But I don't believe it enhances the, at least for me, I was an arm wrestler and I was a weightlifter more than, I wasn't an aesthetic guy. So at least for strength, it had no benefits. It was just like taking an aromatase inhibitor, just a bit weaker. So basically looking back, I would have rather taken an aromatase inhibitor because they're not particularly harmful. If I really wanted to lower estrogen, which I would not have done anyway, so I wouldn't have taken an aromatase inhibitor. But if I really wanted to, I would have taken an aromatase inhibitor. Why? Because I don't know what Masteron is doing exactly in the body, but I know it's not doing something that's yielding a lot of benefit for me. So I don't want to run any risk of it messing with something else or harming something. I also think it's probably a waste of money. I'm not sure if it's more expensive or cheaper than aromatase inhibitors. I think it's more expensive. But it's just sort of like a useless compound. If you want to lower your water retention, you can just take an aromatase inhibitor. You don't need Masteron. If you want more androgens, take the androgens. Because at the end of the day, you don't really know what's going on. So for example, Masteron, like I described before, it may have a very strong affinity for the androgen receptor. It may have a stronger affinity than testosterone. We don't know. So it could bind to the androgen receptor and prevent testosterone from binding to it. Even though testosterone may have a stronger efficacy at getting a result. For example, muscular growth. Masteron doesn't cause much muscular growth, but it may bind very strongly. So it may actually limit results a little bit. Or it may not do that, but one of its metabolites may do that. or it may bind, for example, at progesterone receptor. I don't know what it doesn't bind at progesterone receptors, very unlikely, but it may do some of these things. So anyway, the effect on water retention, also I should mention, it may not be estrogen specifically. So it may be reducing aromatase expression. It could potentially be reducing, be blocking progesterone receptors, which would do that also. But probably it's affecting the mineralocorticoid receptors. So it's changing our mineral retention in our body as well. I think it's probably doing that as well. So this is like a scientific look at Masteron from a person who's used it himself, looking at the papers. I'm just trying to explain to you guys why it's not completely clear scientifically to understand what it's doing. But in terms of the physical effects, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think there's any need to add more androgens, because there's no need anymore to be scared of aromatase inhibitors. You should be scared of having low estrogen, which in either case, both of them would do that. And I think it's just basically a waste. So what I've been trying to do with these steroid profiles that I've been doing is, so far, I don't know how long this will last because I don't like that many steroids, but every other week I do one I like and then I do one I don't like. So this is one I don't like. Next week we're going to do anadrol or oxymethylone, which is one I really do like, even though it's quite harmful for the body. But I'll explain to you guys why I think that one may be worth it, whereas Masteron is just not worth it. There's not very much use for it. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you have suggestions for the one to do after anadrol, please let me know in the comment section below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.